Hello, hello, and welcome from the future. This is Sunny in August 2019, while this class was taught all the way back in fall of 2017. And today is a very special day. Specifically, it's August 1st, 2019, which is, a date that we'll learn about in today's lecture. But it's the Swiss National Day, and so, because of this, I decided, to finally get around to something I've been meaning to do for the past 2 years, which is upload these lectures to the YouTube channel so everyone can watch those. And I realized that all of my lectures up till lecture 8 were recorded, except for lecture 2, which is the Swiss history from, ancient history up until the end of the 19th century. And so for this reason, I figured, let me go ahead and re-record lecture 2. There were a few lectures after lecture 9, but those included some guest speakers and some Jeopardy and stuff. But, without further ado, let's get on to lecture 2. Keep in mind, it's been about 2 years since I taught this course material originally. So just a bit heads up, it will be a little bit rusty, but I'll try my best to see what I can remember from my memory when I was studying this stuff and teaching it 2 years ago. So, like I said, today we'll talk about Swiss history from its origins up until the end of the 19th century, and then in lecture 3, which is on armed neutrality, we will kind of pick up from that and continue into the 20th and 21st centuries. So, without further ado, so early history, archaeological evidence suggests that there were hunter-gatherers settled there in this region by up to 150,000 years ago. So, it's, pretty long settled region. And, we have these remains of Bronze Age pile dwellings, and, stilt houses all the way back from 3800 BC. And, we have evidence that there were these Proto-Celtic tribes that had settled the area by 1500 BC. And so the two main tribes in this region at the time were called the Raetians, or in the east, and the Helvetii in the west. And the term Helvetii is where the modern name for Switzerland actually comes from, the Helvetic Republic, and it's like a throwback to this early tribe that settled this area. And the reason obviously there were people who had settled this area way before the Helvetii and the Raetians, kind of some of the people we mentioned. But why do we call them the Helvetii? Because why are these the ones that stick out? Well, they were the ones who were around when the Roman Empire came and conquered them. So, speaking of the Roman era, what happened during the Roman era? So, for those who are familiar with Roman history, we're not going to delve that deep into it, but, there was the famous Cimbrian War, where these, tribes from the north, people still, even to this day, it was like one of the biggest threats that Rome had ever faced, yet people don't even know the origins of these tribes. But, we can call them Proto-Celtic because a lot of people that's a lot of the theories are around that. But, the Cimbrians and the Teutons decided to attack Rome, and, the Helvetii, some of the Helvetii tribes, the Helvetii were a pretty large group, and so some sub-tribes, participated in that Cimbrian invasion, but they were pretty swiftly beaten back, and they kind of got pushed out again. And, at this time, keep in mind, Switzerland, this area, the Helvetii and the Raetians are not part of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire hasn't quite pushed that much beyond the borders of the Italian peninsula. And so, Switzerland is obviously basically right north of the Italian peninsula. And so, they were pretty, obviously the Cimbrians and the Teutons actually ended up losing the Cimbrian War, and like that, the Helvetii were kind of pushed back, and they kind of stayed back for about 50 years. About 50 years. And then in 58 BC, by this time, Julius Caesar, had already, participated, done his conquest of Gaul and everything. And in 58 BC, the Helvetii tribe, under the leadership of this guy, Orgetorix. They tried to migrate. He tried to, all the sources I can find say migrate his tribe, but I think it's more of a conqueror. But he tried to migrate his tribe from what is today modern Switzerland to Gaul, or what's modern day France, and he was pushed back by Julius Caesar, and took, the most famous battle is the Battle of Bibracte, where Caesar basically, destroyed the Helvetii troops, and after that, basically the Helvetii and the Thracians, Switzerland, it was basically what's modern day Switzerland was basically completely conquered by the Romans, and the Switzerland fell like most of the Europe at the time under Roman rule. And so honestly, there's not really that much interesting to say under what happened to this area under Roman rule. Just pretty much like any of Roman's provinces. It was pretty Germanic, and there was a town. The largest town was called Aventicum. It was the largest town in the Switzerland region and was the capital of this region. And so this is the arena in the town, and it looks very much like the kind of arenas you'll see throughout the Roman Empire. And so it was, Switzerland kind of thrived under this era of Pax Romana. And as the empire fell apart, Rome retreated in 400 AD because of the pushback from many Germanic tribes, and there's entire series of encyclopedias and everything dedicated to the fall of Rome. So you can obviously go look into that. But Rome retreated in 401 AD from the area that is now Switzerland, and it was quickly inhabited by the Burgundians in the west and the Alemanni in the east. And so the Alemanni, by the way, it translates to all men. And what it was sort of a coalition of a bunch of German-speaking tribes, or Germanic tribes. And then the Burgundians, were more sort of East German, but, we're actually seeing here kind of the modern divide of Switzerland into this heavy German-speaking region and a French-speaking region. It can kind of, I think, really be traced back to this early split at the fall of the Roman era between the Burgundians and the Alemanni. And, there are still some vestiges left of that Roman era. There was the Raetia region, the area that was controlled by the Thracians rather than the Helvetii. They actually maintained Roman culture for a period of time longer than the Helvetii region, and almost until 452 AD. And the dialect of Vulgar Latin actually turned into what's today Romansh. It's the fourth national language of Switzerland. German, French, Italian, and this tiny one called Romansh. And so that's sort of a little bit of the origins of that Romansh language, where it is this vestige of the Roman era in Switzerland. So let's go ahead and fast forward a little bit to the medieval ages. This area up until then, it was kind of it was the Burgundians and the Alemanni. They kind of so you can go read the history of how the Holy Roman Empire formed. This entire region sort of became part of the Holy Roman Empire, and the cities of Freiburg and Bern. Bern is today the federal city. They were founded in the 12th century by the Holy Roman Emperor as Reichsfrei, which means it's a concept called imperial immediacy, and Reichsfrei means basically they are free cities, and what this means is they basically answer to no one other than the Holy Roman Emperor directly. So they don't answer to any local rulers or to dukes or any they answer directly to the Holy Roman Emperor. And so Alpine passes were also getting very important, especially the St. Gothard Pass, which is, it's probably one of the most useful trade routes between Italy and, through the Alps to the rest of Europe. And so these Alpine passes were very important, and the Holy Roman Emperor wanted to make sure that, they were kind of under his control directly. And so this is why he granted these two regions or cantons today. Uri and Schweiz were given Reichsfreit. Also basically said, okay, complete imperial immediacy. You don't answer to anyone other than the Holy Roman Emperor either. And then there's this area called Unterwalden, which is basically owned by the monasteries. And so they also, traditionally, the monasteries also, the church doesn't answer to anyone other than, honestly, the Pope, really. But they also had a high amount of independence from the Holy Roman, from any other lords and stuff. And they basically are directly under the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. And so, we can see already from very early on that there's already quite a bit of, the Swiss cantons and these cities are very, maybe they're made a little bit soft. They're very used to having this extreme independence and not answering to anyone other than the Holy Roman Emperor. But the Holy Roman Emperor is all the way off in the doing his own thing, and so for the most part they were basically had their own independence and didn't answer to anyone, which they really liked. And this is often, very common, especially when you look into the history of different, mountain peoples. The Swiss, they're mountain peoples, right? And but then Rudolf I, who was the king of the Habsburgs, he became king of Germany and revoked Reichsfreit. And in April 16th, 1291, he bought all of the rights to the town of Lucerne. And so everyone was very concerned that, oh no, the town of Lucerne is going to come under Habsburg rule, and that they are going to sort of take the entire, cut off all the trading routes over Lake Lucerne, which was, very important. It's a very large lake, and they're really afraid of this. And so, Rudolf I actually died on July 15th of 1291. And kind of in preparation of, as soon as he died, on August 1st, 1291, 3 men met in a meadow and signed a pact. 3 guys from the cantons of Uri, Schweiz, and Unterwalden. And, very interesting. These 3 guys are basically the founding fathers of Switzerland. This is these 3 cantons coming together and basically saying that, hey, look, let's make a defensive alliance. This is called the Old Confederacy. This is the birth of the Old Confederacy. And it was basically born to facilitate free trade and ensure the peace amongst the most important trading routes through the mountains and over Lake Lucerne. What's interesting about this event is, these 3 people, if you go ask a average Swiss person who are the 3 people there, no one's going to know the answer. And it's very, as an American, we're taught the names of all the founding fathers and who did this, who signed the Declaration. Obviously not everyone who signed the Declaration, but we know, we're taught a lot about the founding fathers of the United States. And it's very interesting that the actual names of the people who signed, who kind of did this Old Confederacy Pact are kind of not wiped from history, because obviously we still know them, but for the average person, for all intents and purposes, are not celebrated or anything like that. And also interestingly, that the August 1st is actually, it's unknown if that's actually the exact day. It was kind of described as early August from the records, and so they kind of just. It's unknown exactly the date, but we've kind of, by convention, set it as August 1st. So the Swiss Confederacy, it was put to its first test a couple decades later. It did a good job at preventing the reign of the Austrians constantly attacking. By the way, for going forward, we'll assume that the Swiss's greatest, the one people they hate the most is the Austrians. They absolutely, the Habsburgs were their worst enemies, and they absolutely hated them. And so in 1315 they had one, you have these three small cantons and this great Austrian Empire, and how can these even compare? But in 1315 there was this famous battle called the Battle of Morgarten. It was basically a traditional David and Goliath battle. The Confederates, the Confederacy, they were highly outnumbered, outtrained, and outarmed, but they basically pulled a surprise attack, and they ended up winning the battle. And after this, repelling the Austrians and doing their job as a defensive alliance. And after this, it was so successful that it convinced new cantons to join the Confederacy. And so, along with the original three, also joined were Glarus, Zug, Lucerne, Zurich, and Bern. And so these formed the Acht Orte, which is the 8 states. Then they kind of now the Confederacy has expanded from 3 cantons to 8 cantons, and these 8 cantons were sort of formed the core of the old Confederacy through much of the 15th century, and they constantly, in a number of battles, they defeated the Habsburgs to get even, more autonomy, and so they really did prove themselves as a pretty formidable fighting force. And so this was really put to the test in 1476 when the Burgundian Duke, Charles the Bold, decides to use the opportunity to take control over Europe. So at this point, France and England had just fought the 100 Years' War, and they were, tired of war and fully exhausted. Germany and Italy were just destroyed, and the Burgundian Duke decides to use this opportunity to take over all of Europe. But the Swiss stopped him twice, and they basically are kind of almost responsible for saving Europe at this point. And after this battle, they were, just considered absolutely invincible. These small mountain tribes essentially, fought off this giant threat to all of Europe. And so after this, the Swiss basically became world-renowned mercenaries. And they were so good mercenaries that even the Pope wanted in. And so this is actually the origin of the Papal Swiss Guard, which was founded in 1505. And so the Habsburg, seeing this, the Habsburg Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire encouraged for an association called the Swabian League for all the imperial states. The Swabian League is supposed to be this sort of all of the Reichsfrei in throughout the Holy Roman Empire that are all these free states should kind of, let's put them all under one jurisdiction called the Swabian League. And when I say, encourage, I'm saying that with huge quotes. It's he's encouraging this association. And the Swiss didn't want in. And so they went to war with the Swabian League, and, they won. And so, the Swiss are just constantly getting this, reputation as these amazing warriors and fighters. And as such, their mercenaries, the mercenaries are even more and more desired. And, the Swiss start to have, even dreams of, even further expansion at this point. And so in 1517, they take the city of Milan, and they were quickly soon later attacked by the French in the Battle of Marignano. And in this battle, the invincible Swiss were finally defeated. Almost after a century of this fighting prowess, they had their first major defeat. And their reaction, or I'll call it an overreaction, was they're oh, okay, we lost this one time, it's time to become completely neutral. And they decided, we're going to stop being expansionary, and we're just gonna, become the completely neutral and defensive alliance, no more expansion. And it's kind of like, it kind of, and that tradition stays until today almost. And it's kind of really funny that, I don't know, it seems a bit, to me at least, like a bit of a overreaction that it's such a wild swing after suffering a single defeat. But, what they did was they still offered mercenaries to the rest of Europe. So while Switzerland itself continued to be neutral, it was a they continued to provide mercenaries for the rest of Europe, and it was a huge business for them, actually. And for anyone who's paying attention to where we are on the timeline, something very important happens in the year 1517, the Reformation. And so, this Protestant Reformation is like sweeping over Europe. And what happens in this period of time is, of the cantons, now there's a few more that got added along the way, but 4 of them became Protestant, 7 of them remained Catholic, and 2 of them were split. And the, Zurich was Protestant, and, we can see this map here that kind of shows the split. It was very clearly definitely a north-south split, as you can see, to an extent. And, like one of the main reasons why a lot more of the cantons actually wanted to remain Catholic was that one of the things that the Protestant Reformation was kind of combating was this idea of mercenaries, and they were seen as unethical and unreligious. But the mercenary business was such a lucrative business for these cantons, and so they decided, they wanted to remain Catholic because they didn't want to undermine their business that they had going for them. And so these 5 cantons, 5 of the 7 actually made this thing called the League of 5 Cantons, and they kind of had multiple minor civil wars between Protestants and Catholics throughout this time. But none of those civil wars really, never turned into anything major or anything, and Switzerland was still seen as a relatively, peaceful place. And in fact, it was like this oasis of peace and prosperity during the 30 Years' War. While the rest of Europe was kind of fighting and everything, Switzerland was completely neutral. It obviously went ahead and continued to provide mercenaries and whatnot, but it remained completely neutral. And afterwards, at the famous Treaty of Westphalia, independence to Switzerland was finally given from the Holy Roman Empire. Like, up until now, Switzerland was, it was acting pretty independently, like, literally sending troops against Holy Roman Empire troops. But for the most part, it was still nominally under the Holy Roman Empire. After the Treaty of Westphalia, it was like, okay, it's completely separate, and it has its own absolute independence. And, there's not much else to say here. There was a small peasant war during the currency devaluation, but nothing really major. And during this period, they get more cantons and some what they call associates of the Confederacy. And so the major associate, the most important one, is probably the city of Geneva, and also the city of St. Gallen as well. But this is around the time after the Treaty of Westphalia that Geneva joined the Confederation as this associate member. Then, we have this period of peace, but then along comes yet another, threat to Switzerland's borders, the Napoleonic era. And so, Napoleon invaded Switzerland and established the Helvetic Republic. There was quite a bit of resistance, especially in the Catholic cantons. But, at this period of time, while Napoleon was there, he created even more cantons. And during this entire time, the Swiss people really resented the loss of local democracy, centralization, taxes, warfare. You have to keep in mind, so one of the things that's kind of important is that, like, up until now, Switzerland has still been a confederation. It's really, there's no Swiss government. It literally is just a defense alliance. You can consider it almost as loose as, like, we'd consider NATO to be today. And they don't see themselves as a country yet. But, Napoleon, for, we'll call it operational efficiency, he kind of said, okay, you you guys are all part of this defensive alliance. Okay, I'm going to put a governor in charge of just governing this entire area. And this is the first time Switzerland as an entity really has any sort of single government of sorts. The Swiss, they hated having, being occupied by the French, hosting the soldiers and everything. But you know who they hated more? Their one greatest enemy in the world. The Austrians invade Switzerland to fight the French in, as part of the Napoleonic Wars. And, they like hate, the Swiss hated the French, but, they'd rather have the French over the Austrians. And, this actually is the period of the time where the tale of William Tell becomes popularized around this time, because it was this, story about, fighting the Austrian Habsburgs and stuff. And so Switzerland kind of, really hates both sides. They just want to be left alone. They just hate that they're being, occupied, and then, they're being liberated, but, through another occupation and whatnot. And so, France, the Austrians end up not successfully beating off the French at this point. And so, Napoleon continues to control this area. He designed this absolutely disgusting flag that you can see on the right side there. And this unitary government he had actually failed. It was just not, the Swiss people just hated it so much, and so they kind of fought against it pretty heavily. And so Napoleon actually ended up switching back to a confederation, but, with some slight improvements where, they still had a little bit of federal unity, but not, it's not that unitary system that, France really is. And so they kind of realized the French model doesn't work with a different set of people. So, fast forward a couple of years, Napoleon was beaten twice. You can go read your history book about that. And so the Congress of Vienna reestablished Swiss independence and neutrality, just like after the Treaty of Westphalia, and the borders of Switzerland were basically set to what is the current today borders. And at this time, the Protestant took over the federal diet, or the legislative body, essentially, and they proposed a new constitution that would take a closer look, create a closer relationship between the cantons. And so I wrote a paper on this, comparing Switzerland to Belgium, and I did a lot of research on the Swiss nation building. And, it was interesting what happened, during this period. Like I mentioned, the Catholics were really the ones who were more against Napoleon, and they really, a lot of people hated the French. They hated this occupation that this foreign power, even the Protestants hated the occupation that the foreign power had over their region. But they were, this more centralized power system. They didn't like the unitary system, but this a little bit more organized confederation that the Napoleonic era had left. People really some people really liked it. They're like, wait a second, that was pretty nice. We should maybe try to do that again or something, And so they kind of engaged in this period of nation building. And so they tried to go ahead and they proposed a new constitution that would create this closer relationship between the cantons. And the Sonderbund Alliance just wasn't having it. It was a group of 7 southern Catholic cantons, and they basically decided to create a separate, according to the and according to the rules of the Confederation, this was against the and so the Protestants basically said that no, this is against the Constitution, when the Sonderbund never really agreed to the Constitution. And this essentially led to Switzerland's civil war in 1847. And it lasted less than a month, and only about 130 people were killed. It's the most Swiss civil war you can imagine. But, it's very, I always find this very kind of funny because Switzerland called itself a confederation, and the purpose of a confederation, the difference between a confederacy and a federation is when you want to leave a confederation, you're allowed to. And so when these cantons decided to try to leave the confederation, they were told they're not allowed to. And so, it led to this civil war. Didn't last very long at all. And, the Protestants kind of pretty swiftly won, not a lot of casualties. And then the Sonderborn, after the end of the war, the Sonderborn cantons, some of the people who really hated it, they fled actually a lot to Italy. But most of the people who stayed, they were invited to help draft a new federal constitution. And interestingly, it's actually very, very heavily based off of the American one. And so it is, you can read the title. It's kind of funny, where it's the Federal Constitution of the Swiss Confederation. So they just continue to call themselves the Swiss Confederation, but now it is like very clearly that it is a federation, not a confederation. So very heavily inspired by the American one, and they took a national vote whether to adopt it, and it was a landslide victory for adopting the Constitution, 2 million to 300,000, and they basically ended this all in 1957, and they avoided all the civil wars that plagued Europe the following year. So if you know anything about European history, 1848 and 1849, like civil wars like swept throughout all of Europe, and Switzerland kind of, they're like, oh, we had our little civil war last year, we're chilling now. And ever since then, communication and compromise is like become the Swiss way of solving disputes. And this is this period where they kind of went through this great nation building process. I wrote a paper on this actually a couple years ago, where they, the ethno-symbolism and constructism that they used, rapid industrial, they took a lot of old ideas, like they found this old coat of arms from a long time ago. They're like, all right, let's make this the Swiss flag. They heavily emphasize tales like William Tell, and like they decided to make a national day and a lot of hymns, and and so they decided to they set the national day and they really glorified the story of the founding of the old Confederacy. And so I think I have a link to my paper at the end of the slide. So they took a lot of there's this British guy named Mr. Cook, and he led to this golden age of alpinism, where he basically showed throughout Europe, Switzerland became this like tourist hotspot for anyone who wanted to go skiing or alpine or winter adventures. It became and the Swiss really used this alpinism as a like a national symbol. Like they were very proud of it, and it became a lot of the symbology, and so they really took this. And during this era we had a lot of very rapid industrial and economic growth. And we can see here really quickly the how the borders of Switzerland have increased over the years. So, that kind of essentially takes us up to close to the end of the 19th century. And so some some of the questions from the class at the time that people had for homework, where they had to write a paragraph on this, where one was, what are some examples of Swiss history shaping the national mindset today regarding neutrality and self-determination? What inspired the reaction in Swiss foreign policy after the Battle of Marcignano? And so why are there so few statues, monuments, etc., commemorating Swiss history? If you go through, they're just, it's not like we have in the U.S. where, like, we heavily glorify the people especially. And so why is this? And so so one of the questions there, and so if anyone who's doing the reading as well, you can follow along. Here's the reading, especially if you're doing the reading the book, Swiss Watching Chapter 4. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture.